It was a regular morning at the studio where The View is filmed. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was buzzing with excitement. People had come from all over to be part of this popular talk show, hoping for some drama, laughter, or maybe even a little bit of both. The hosts were already seated at their usual round table, chatting away about the latest news and trends. Everything seemed normal, until something unexpected happened. Just as the show was about to start, a name popped up on the teleprompter that no one saw coming. Special guest, Mel Gibson. The room went wild. People clapped, cheered, and some even stood up in shock. Mel Gibson? Really? It felt like a scene out of a movie. For years, Gibson had stayed away from daytime TV, focusing more on his films and keeping a low profile after some controversies. So why was he here now? And what did it mean? When Mel walked onto the stage, you could feel the energy shift. He looked sharp in a well-fitted suit, exuding confidence but also a sense of calm. There was an air of mystery around him. Was he nervous? Excited? No one knew for sure. But one thing was clear. The audience loved having him there. They screamed louder than they had for any guest in recent memory. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting across from him, leaned forward in her chair. She had that mischievous glint in her eye, the kind she gets when she knows she's about to dive into a juicy topic. Whoopi isn't someone who holds back, especially not on live TV. If there's something worth saying, she'll say it. And today, with Mel Gibson sitting right in front of her, she seemed ready to go head first into whatever needed to be said. As soon as Mel took his seat, the conversation began. Whoopi didn't waste a second. She greeted him warmly but quickly pivoted to asking tough questions. "So, Mel," she started, her voice playful yet pointed, "what brings you here today? Are you trying to make amends with the world or just looking for free publicity?" The crowd laughed, but there was truth behind her words. Everyone knew Mel's history. His incredible success as an actor and filmmaker, yes, but also the controversies that followed him like shadows. Mel chuckled, softly, clearly aware of the challenge ahead. He didn't dodge the question. Instead, he leaned in, making eye contact with Whoopi. "Well, Whoopi," he replied, his tone measured. "I guess I'm here because I've got stories to tell. And if I can share a few lessons while I'm at it, then maybe we'll all walk away better for it." The audience loved that response. It wasn't defensive or rehearsed, it felt genuine. You could see people nodding along, intrigued by what might come next. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, almost as if she was impressed, but still skeptical. She wasn't going to let him off easy, and everyone knew it. What made this moment so captivating wasn't just the celebrity factor. It was the human element. Here were two strong personalities, each with their own opinions and experiences, sitting face to face. One was known for speaking her mind without fear, and the other was known for surviving storms most would have crumbled under. Their dynamic was magnetic, pulling viewers in like moths to a flame. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was personal. Whoopi kept pushing, asking questions that others might shy away from. She brought up topics that had been debated online and offline for years, yet instead of shutting down or getting angry, Mel responded with surprising grace. He admitted his mistakes, acknowledged the pain he'd caused, and talked about how he was working to grow as a person. The audience hung on to every word. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered to their neighbors, and a few even wiped tears from their eyes. It was raw, real, and unfiltered, a reminder that even those in the spotlight are human beings with flaws and struggles. By the time the first segment ended, the atmosphere in the studio was electric. People weren't just entertained. They were moved. They weren't just watching a TV show. They were witnessing a rare moment of connection between two very different individuals. And deep down, everyone wondered, where would this conversation go next? Would Whoopi keep pressing harder? Would Mel continue to open up? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The stage was set for something unforgettable. The conversation between Whoopi and Mel Gibson was heating up, and the audience couldn't get enough. Whoopi wasn't holding back, she never does, and she had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things. As the second, Segment began. She leaned forward again, her signature humor mixed with a sharp edge. "All right, Mel," she said, her voice firm but playful. "Let's talk about some of the stuff people still remember. You've had your ups and downs, we all know that. But how do you deal with it when people bring up your past? Do you ever feel like saying, 'Can we just move on already?'" The crowd chuckled, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness in the room. Everyone knew what she was referring to. Mel's history wasn't exactly a secret. It had been splashed across headlines for years. Some of the things he'd said and done had sparked outrage and divided opinions. For many, it was hard to separate the man from the controversies, and Whoopi wasn't going to let him off the hook. Mel took a deep breath before responding. He didn't rush or stumble over his words. Instead, he looked directly at Whoopi, as if making sure she and everyone else knew he was being sincere. "You're right," he admitted. "People have every reason to bring up my past. I've made mistakes, big ones, things I'm not proud of. But here's the thing, I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to be better moving forward." His answer caught the audience off guard. It wasn't defensive or dismissive. There was no hint of arrogance. Instead, it felt honest, almost vulnerable. People started nodding along, whispering to each other. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily taken aback. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if trying to gauge whether he truly meant what he was saying. But Whoopi isn't someone who lets moments of silence linger for too long. She quickly fired back. "Okay, fair enough, but let me ask you this. When you say you're trying to be better, what does that actually look like? Because a lot of folks out there hear apologies, but they don't always see action." Her question hung in the air for a moment. It was a challenge, plain and simple. The camera zoomed in on Mel's face, capturing every flicker of emotion. For a split second, he looked reflective, maybe even a little pensive. Then he smiled faintly and said, "I get why people are skeptical. Honestly, I would be too if I were them. Actions speak louder than words. That's something I've learned the hard way." He went on to share examples from his life, talking about moments where he'd tried to make amends or grow as a person. He mentioned working closely with charities, spending time with family, and focusing on projects that mattered to him. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He admitted that growth wasn't easy and that he still had work to do. Whoopi listened carefully, her expression softening just a fraction. She wasn't ready to let him off the hook completely, though. With a sly grin, she quipped, "Well, I'll give you credit for owning up to your messes. But let's not act like you're suddenly a saint now, okay? We're keeping tabs." Tisao's audience erupted into laughter. Whoopi's ability to balance tough questions with humor was one of the reasons people loved her. She kept the tone light enough to keep things entertaining, but she never strayed too far from the serious topics at hand. And Mel seemed to appreciate it. He laughed along with her, clearly enjoying the back and forth. As the discussion continued, Whoopi shifted gears slightly, bringing up Mel's career. She asked him about his passion for storytelling and how he chose which projects to take on. This was familiar territory for Mel, and he lit up as he talked about his love for filmmaking. He described how movies could transport people to different worlds, evoke emotions, and spark conversations. He spoke passionately about wanting to create stories that resonated with audiences on a deeper level. Whoopi nodded thoughtfully, chiming in with her own thoughts. "You know, I've always respected your dedication to your craft. Whether people like you or not, they can't deny that you put everything into your work. That kind of commitment deserves recognition." It was a rare compliment coming from Whoopi, and the audience noticed. They clapped enthusiastically, appreciating the moment of mutual respect between the two. But just as quickly as the mood softened, Whoopi brought the intensity back. She raised another controversial topic, pushing Mel to explain how he reconciled his personal beliefs with his public image. This time, Mel hesitated. It was clear he was choosing his words carefully. "Look," he finally said, "I'm not perfect. I've got strong opinions, and sometimes I express them poorly. But I believe in open dialogue. If we can't talk about our differences, even the uncomfortable ones, how do we ever find common ground?" Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by his response. She murmured, tapping her fingers on the table. That's a good point. But let me ask you this. How do you handle it when people disagree with you so strongly that they refuse to listen? Mel sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's tough, he admitted. There are days when it feels like no matter what I say or do, it won't change anyone's mind. But I remind myself that not everyone has to agree with me. What matters is staying true to who I am while respecting others' perspectives. The sincerity in his voice struck a chord with the audience. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on to every word. It wasn't just about Mel Gibson anymore, it was about the bigger picture. His answers weren't perfect, but they were real. And in a world filled with polished PR statements and rehearsed responses, authenticity stood out. By the end of the second segment, the energy in the studio was electric. The audience was fully invested, reacting to every exchange between Whoopi and Mel. Some cheered, others clapped, and a few even wiped away tears. It was more than just a TV show, it was a human connection unfolding live on camera. And as the commercial break approached, the hosts teased that the best was yet to come, leaving viewers eager to see what would happen next. When the show came back from the commercial break, the energy in the studio was still buzzing. The audience hadn't stopped talking during the pause, and it was clear that Mel Gibson's appearance was turning into something special. Whoopi Goldberg wasted no time diving back in. She wasn't about to let the momentum slip away. "All right, Mel," she said, leaning forward with a mischievous grin. "Let's get real here. You've been in this business for decades. You've made some of the most iconic movies of our time, but you've also faced your fair share of criticism, both professionally and personally. How do you separate the two? Does one ever overshadow the other?" Mel chuckled softly, his eyes narrowing as he thought about her question. He didn't rush to answer, and the pause itself seemed to speak volumes. Finally, he said, "You know, Whoopi, I don't think you can really separate them. My personal life and my career, they're intertwined. They always have been. When I mess up in one area, it affects the other. And honestly, I think that's fair. If people are going to celebrate me when things are good, they're allowed to criticize me when things go wrong." The honesty in his response caught everyone off guard. It wasn't rehearsed or polished, it felt raw and genuine. The audience murmured their approval, nodding along as if they understood exactly what he meant. Whoopi tilted her head, clearly intrigued by his candor. "But here's the thing," Mel continued, his voice steady but reflective. "I've learned that you can't control how people see you. All you can do is try to be honest, with yourself and with others. Sometimes that means owning up to your mistakes. Other times it means standing by your convictions even when it's hard." Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly not ready to let him off the hook just yet. "Okay, but let's get specific," she said, her tone sharpening slightly. "There was that one incident." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "Where a lot of people felt hurt by what you said. Do you think you handled it the right way at the time? Or looking back, would you have done things differently?" The room went quiet. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The camera zoomed in on Mel's face, capturing every flicker of emotion. For a split second, he looked uncomfortable, like he was wrestling with whether to open up further or keep things vague. But then he exhaled deeply and said, "Yeah, I'd do it differently. No doubt about it. At the time I thought I was being honest, but I realize now that honesty without empathy can come across as harsh, or worse, hurtful, and that's not who I want to be." The audience erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of polite clapping you hear after a generic answer. It was heartfelt, almost emotional. People were moved by his willingness to admit fault, especially on live television. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily disarmed. She leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully, as if trying to decide whether to soften her approach or keep pressing harder. "Well, I'll give you credit for that," she finally said, her voice tinged with both humor and sincerity. "Not many people in your position would admit to screwing up so openly. But let me ask you this. What about now? Are you still learning? Because let's face it, nobody's perfect, not even you. Mel laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that made the audience chuckle along with him. Absolutely, he replied. I'm always learning. Every day is a new lesson, whether I like it or not. Some days I feel like I'm getting better at navigating this crazy world we live in. Other days I stumble, but I think that's part of being human, isn't it? Whoopi nodded slowly, her expression softening just a fraction. You're right about that, she admitted. We're all works in progress. But here's the kicker. People expect more from someone like you. They hold you to a higher standard because of who you are and what you represent. So how do you handle that pressure? Mel didn't hesitate this time. It's tough, he admitted. There are days when the weight of expectations feels overwhelming. But I remind myself that I'm not perfect and neither is anyone else. What matters is that I keep showing up, whether it's for my family, my work, or even moments like this where I'm sitting across from someone like you, answering tough questions. The audience loved that line. They cheered loudly, appreciating the mutual respect that was starting to emerge between Whoopi and Mel. It wasn't a full-blown truce. Whoopi still had plenty of sharp questions up her sleeve. But there was a growing sense of understanding between them. As the conversation shifted gears, Whoopi brought up another topic that had been swirling in the media lately: cancel culture. Let's talk about this whole idea of being canceled, she said, gesturing emphatically with her hands. Some people think it's justified while others say it goes too far. Where do you stand on it? Mel took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. I think it's complicated, he began. On one hand, I understand why people want accountability. We should call out harmful behavior and demand better from those in positions of power. But on the other hand, I worry that cancel culture sometimes leaves no room for growth or redemption. If someone makes a mistake, shouldn't they have the chance to learn from it and make amends? Whoopi nodded thoughtfully, clearly agreeing with parts of what he was saying. That's true, she said. But here's the problem. How do we decide who deserves a second chance and who doesn't? Isn't that subjective? Mel shrugged, acknowledging the complexity of the issue. It is subjective, he admitted, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's less about having a universal rule and more about trusting people to use their judgment. Not everyone will agree, and that's fine. What matters is that we keep having these conversations even when they're uncomfortable. The audience clapped again, clearly resonating with his perspective. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was refreshingly honest. Whoopi smiled faintly, sensing that the segment was reaching its peak. She glanced at the clock, knowing they only had a few minutes left, and decided to end with one final zinger. All right, Mel, she said, leaning forward with a playful smirk. Last question. If you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be? Mel laughed, shaking his head at the irony of the question. Wow, that's a tough one, he said, rubbing his chin theatrically. I guess I'd tell him to listen more and talk less, and maybe to think twice before opening his mouth in certain situations. The audience roared with laughter, loving the self-deprecating humor. Whoopi grinned, clearly satisfied with his answer. Well, I think we can all agree on that, she said, raising her hand for a high five. Mel obliged, and the two shared a brief but meaningful moment of connection. As the segment wrapped up, the host thanked Mel for joining them, praising him for his honesty and openness. The audience gave him a standing ovation, cheering wildly as he stood to leave. It was a rare moment of unity, one that transcended politics, entertainment, and personal differences. And as the credits rolled, it was clear that something unforgettable had just happened. By the time the fourth segment rolled around, the energy in the studio had reached a fever pitch. The audience was completely hooked, hanging on every word exchanged between Whoopi and Mel Gibson. It wasn't just about the spectacle anymore. It felt personal, like they were witnessing two strong personalities hashing out life's complexities in real time. And as the conversation turned toward more universal topics, the mood shifted slightly, becoming lighter, but no less engaging. Whoopi leaned forward again, her signature wit gleaming in her eyes. All right, Mel, she said with a playful smirk. Let's switch gears for a minute. We've talked about the heavy stuff, mistakes, growth, cancel culture, all that good stuff. But let's talk about something fun for once. What keeps you going? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Mel chuckled, clearly appreciating the change of pace. He didn't answer right away, instead taking a moment to think. When he finally spoke, his tone was warm and reflective. You know, it's funny you ask that, he began. I think what keeps me going is storytelling. Whether it's through movies, books, or even just conversations like this one, I love the idea of connecting with people through stories. There's something magical about sharing experiences, emotions, and lessons. The audience nodded along, clearly resonating with his sentiment. Whoopi tilted her head, intrigued by his response. Okay, but let's get specific, she prodded, always eager to dig deeper. What kind of stories inspire you? Are we talking epic battles and heroes saving the day, or are you into the quieter, more personal stuff too? Mel smiled, leaning back in his chair as if savoring the question. Both, honestly, he replied. I mean, sure, I've always been drawn to big, sweeping tales like the ones where someone overcomes incredible odds or fights for what they believe in. Those stories remind us of our potential, you know. But I also love the smaller, more intimate moments. The kind of stories that make you stop and think, wow, I felt that way before. Those are the ones that stick with you long after the credits roll. Whoopi nodded thoughtfully, her expression softening. That makes sense, she admitted. I think we all need both kinds of stories in our lives. The grand adventures help us dream bigger, while the quiet moments keep us grounded. Speaking of which, she paused, glancing at the audience with a knowing grin. Do you ever watch your old movies? Like, do you sit down and relive the glory days, or do you avoid them because it's weird seeing yourself on screen? The crowd erupted into laughter, clearly loving the light-hearted turn in the conversation. Mel laughed along, shaking his head. Oh man, I try not to watch them, he confessed. It's not that I don't like my work, I'm proud of a lot of it. But watching yourself on screen can be, well, awkward. You see things you wish you'd done differently, moments where you could have pushed harder or taken a different approach. It's humbling, to say the least. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying his candor. Humbling, huh? So you're saying you're not sitting at home rewatching Braveheart every Friday night? She teased, drawing even louder laughs from the audience. Mel grinned, playing along. Not every Friday night, he joked. Maybe once a month, tops. The room erupted again, the laughter filling the studio like waves crashing against the shore. For a moment, it felt less like a serious interview and more like two friends swapping jokes over coffee. But Whoopi wasn't about to let the levity last too long. With a sly smile, she brought the conversation back to a slightly deeper place. All right, enough about you, she quipped, gesturing dramatically. Let's talk about the next generation. You've got kids, right? How do you pass on those lessons you've learned, the hard ones especially, to them? Do you sit them down and say, hey, here's what Dad did wrong so you don't have to? Mel's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of genuine affection. Yeah, I do, he admitted softly. Being a parent changes everything. You realize pretty quickly that your job isn't just to protect them, it's to prepare them for the world. And part of that means being honest about your own mistakes. I want my kids to know that messing up doesn't define you. It's how you handle it that matters. The sincerity in his voice struck a chord with the audience. People started whispering to each other, nodding in agreement. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily moved. That's powerful, she said quietly, her usual sharpness softened by the weight of his words. I think a lot of parents struggle with that balance, wanting to shield their kids while also preparing them for reality. It's not easy. No, it's not, Mel agreed. But it's worth it. Every tough conversation, every late night, heart to heart, it's all worth it if it helps them navigate life a little better. The audience clapped warmly, clearly touched by the exchange. For a few seconds, the mood in the room felt almost tender. But Whoopi, ever the master of keeping things lively, quickly brought the energy back up. All right, enough mushy stuff, she declared, waving her hands theatrically. Let's talk about something everyone really wants to know. Any new projects coming up? Or are you officially retired and just living the good life now? Mel laughed, clearly amused by her bluntness. Retired? Not quite, he replied with a grin. I've got a few things in the works, actually. Nothing I can spill the beans on yet, but let's just say I'm still chasing those stories I mentioned earlier. If I can create something that moves people, even just a little bit, I'll keep doing it. Whoopi nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by his dedication. Well, I hope you bring whatever it is to the View first, she joked, earning another round of applause from the audience. We'll give you the full treatment. Tough questions, dad jokes, the whole 9 yards. Mel laughed heartily, raising his hands in mock surrender. Deal, he said. Just promise me you won't go easy on me next time. The banter continued for a few more minutes, with Whoopi firing off quick-fire questions and Mel responding, with equal parts humor and insight. By the time the segment wrapped up, the audience was buzzing with excitement. They weren't just entertained. They felt connected. It was clear that this wasn't just another celebrity appearance. This was a human moment, captured live on camera, and it left everyone wanting more. As the host thanked Mel once again and teased the final segment, the audience gave him another standing ovation. The cheers echoed through the studio, a testament to the impact of his honesty, humility, and charm. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. No one would forget this episode anytime soon. As the 5th segment began, the energy in the studio was still buzzing with excitement. The audience had been on an emotional roller coaster, laughing, nodding along, and even tearing up at moments, but they weren't ready for the ride to end. Just yet. Whoopi Goldberg glanced at the clock, knowing they were nearing the final stretch of the interview, but she wasn't about to let things wind down without a bang. With her signature flair, she leaned forward and decided to dive into something that would resonate deeply with everyone watching. Resilience. All right, Mel, she said, her tone shifting slightly to something more thoughtful. We've talked about your past, your career, your family, all the big stuff. But I want to zoom out for a second. You've been through some serious ups and downs, not just professionally, but personally too. What's the secret? How do you keep getting back up when life knocks you down? Mel didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, as if weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the room. You know, Whoopi, I think it comes down to one thing. Perspective. Life is messy. It always has been, and it always will be. But how you choose to look at those challenges makes all the difference. Some days it feels like the world is against you. Other days you realize those struggles are shaping you into who you're meant to become. The audience hung on to every word, their eyes glued to him. It wasn't the kind of response you'd expect from a Hollywood star known for larger-than-life roles. This wasn't scripted or polished. It felt real, almost raw. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by his answer. Okay, but let's get practical here, she pressed. Perspective sounds great, but how do you actually do that? Like, when you're in the middle of a tough situation, what goes through your head? Mel chuckled softly, shaking his head. It's not easy, trust me, he admitted. There's no magic formula. Sometimes it's sheer stubbornness. You refuse to give up because you know there's more ahead. Other times it's leaning on the people around you, family, friends, mentors. They remind you that you're not alone. And honestly, sometimes it's just taking it one day at a time. One step forward, no matter how small. Whoopi nodded slowly, clearly moved by his honesty. She leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment before responding. That's powerful, she said, her voice softer now. I think a lot of us can relate to that. We all have those days where we feel like we're drowning, but hearing someone say, hey, I've been there too and I made it through, that means something. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. People were clapping not just for Mel, but for the universal truth in his words. Life isn't perfect, and neither are any of us, but there's beauty in perseverance. Whoopi smiled faintly, sensing the weight of the moment. She decided to lighten the mood just a little, bringing back her trademark humor. All right, enough of the deep stuff, she quipped, waving her hands theatrically. Let's talk about something fun for a change. If you could pick one role, from Any movie, any character? Which one would you say defines you the most? Not necessarily your favorite, but the one that feels closest to who you are. Mel laughed, clearly enjoying the question. He didn't hesitate this time, his face lighting up as he thought about it. That's a tough one, he said, scratching his chin playfully. But if I had to choose, I'd probably say William Wallace from Braveheart. Not because I'm some fearless warrior or anything, but because he stood up for what he believed in, even when the odds were stacked against him. There's something about fighting for justice, for freedom, that resonates with me. The crowd cheered loudly, clearly loving the throwback to one of his most iconic roles. Whoopi grinned, leaning forward with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Oh, come on, Mel," she teased. "Are you saying you're not a fearless warrior? Because I beg to differ." "Look at everything you've been through. You're basically the real-life version of William Wallace." Mel burst out laughing, throwing his head back in genuine amusement. "If only," he joked. "Trust me, I'm no hero. Just a guy trying to figure things out like everyone else." The audience roared with laughter, soaking in the light-hearted banter. For a moment, it felt less like a formal interview and more like two old friends catching up over coffee. But Whoopi wasn't done yet. With a sly smile, she brought the conversation back to the audience, making it interactive. "All right, folks," she announced, turning to the crowd. "Here's the deal. If you could ask Mel one question, just one, what would it be? Shout it out and maybe we'll pick a winner." The room exploded with voices, everyone eager to participate. Some shouted questions about his upcoming projects, while others asked about his favorite memories from filming. One person called out, "What's the best advice you've ever received?" Another chimed in, "Do you believe in second chances?" Whoopi listened intently, pointing to different sections of the audience as she tried to single out the best question. Finally, she settled on a young woman sitting near the front. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Whoopi encouraged. "What's your question?" The woman stood up nervously, clutching her hands together. "Hi, Mr. Gibson," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My question is, how do you stay hopeful when things seem hopeless? Like, when everything feels like it's falling apart, how do you keep believing that things will get better?" Mel's expression softened immediately. He looked directly at the woman, his gaze steady and reassuring. "That's a beautiful question," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "And honestly, it's something I've asked myself plenty of times. For me, hope comes from faith. Not necessarily religious faith, though that helps for some people, but faith in the idea that tomorrow can be better than today. Even when it feels impossible, holding on to that tiny spark of belief can make all the difference." The audience erupted into applause again, many people wiping tears from their eyes. It was a simple answer, but it carried so much weight. Whoopi smiled, clearly touched by the moment. "Well said," she murmured, giving Mel a nod of approval. "I think we could all use a little more hope these days." As the segment drew to a close, Whoopi thanked the audience for their participation and turned back to Mel. "All right, buddy," she said with a playful grin. "Last bit of wisdom before we wrap this up. If you could leave everyone here and everyone watching, at home, with one takeaway from today, what would it be?" Mel took a moment to think, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but profound. "I'd say this. Life is hard, but it's also beautiful. Don't be afraid to stumble, to fall, to mess up. Those moments don't define you. It's how you rise from them that matters. And remember, you're never truly alone. Lean on the people who care about you, and don't forget to lean on yourself too." The audience gave him another standing ovation, their cheers filling the studio with pure energy. It was clear that this wasn't just another celebrity appearance, it was a lesson in humanity, vulnerability, and resilience. As the hosts prepared to transition to the final segment, the room buzzed with anticipation. Whatever came next, one thing was certain: this episode of The View would be remembered for years to come. As the final segment of The View began, the energy in the studio felt electric. The audience was still buzzing from everything that had unfolded so far, moments of laughter, reflection, and even a few tears. It was clear that this episode had become something special, not just for those in the room, but for everyone watching at home. Whoopi Goldberg glanced over at Mel Gibson, who was sitting comfortably in his chair, looking more relaxed than he had at the start of the show. She leaned forward with a mischievous grin, ready to wrap things up with her signature blend of humor and heart. "All right, Mel," she said, her tone playful yet warm. "We're almost done here, but before we let you go, I've got one last curveball for you. If you could describe today's conversation in 3 words, what would they be?" Mel laughed softly, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected question. He tilted his head, thinking carefully before responding. "Honest, challenging, and hopeful," he finally said, nodding as if satisfied with his choice of words. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Hopeful, huh? That's interesting. Why hopeful?" Mel smiled faintly, his eyes scanning the audience as if drawing inspiration from their faces. "Because despite all the tough questions and hard truths we talked about today, there's still a sense of possibility. People want to understand each other, to connect. And if we can have conversations like this, even when they're uncomfortable, it gives me hope that we're moving in the right direction." The audience erupted into applause, many people nodding along in agreement. Whoopi grinned, clearly pleased with his answer. "Well, I'll drink to that," she joked, raising an imaginary glass. "Here's to honesty, challenges, and a whole lot of hope." The light-hearted moment brought laughter from the crowd, but Whoopi wasn't quite ready to end things on such a breezy note. With a sly smile, she turned to her co-hosts, Joy Behar and Sunny Hostin, who had been quietly observing the conversation unfold. "What do you guys think?" she asked, gesturing toward them. "Any final thoughts or burning questions for our guest of honor?" Joy jumped in first, leaning forward with her trademark wit. "You know, Mel, I've got to say, I came into this thinking, this is either going to be a train wreck or a masterpiece. And honestly, I think it's leaning more toward masterpiece." The audience cheered loudly, clearly agreeing with her assessment. Sunny chimed in next, her voice thoughtful and measured. "I think what stood out to me most was your willingness to be vulnerable. A lot of people in your position might shy away from these kinds of conversations, but you didn't. You leaned in, and I think that says a lot about where you are in life right now." Mel nodded appreciatively, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That means a lot coming from both of you. To be honest, I wasn't sure how today was going to go. But sitting here, talking with all of you and hearing from the audience, it's reminded me why these kinds of exchanges matter. They remind us that we're all human, doing the best we can." Whoopi clapped her hands together, clearly moved by the sentiment. All right, enough mushy stuff," she teased, though her own eyes glistened slightly. "Let's finish strong. Here's my last question for you, Mel. If someone walked away from this interview remembering only one thing about you, what would you want that to be?" Mel paused, taking a deep breath as he considered the weight of her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet conviction that silenced the room. "I'd want them to remember that I'm trying," he said simply. "Trying to learn, trying to grow, trying to do better. Not just for myself, but for the people around me. None of us are perfect, but we can all strive to be better versions of ourselves." The audience went wild, erupting into thunderous applause. People stood up, cheering and whistling as if they were at a concert rather than a daytime talk show. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a genuine outpouring of appreciation for the man sitting across from Whoopi. For a brief moment, the cameras panned across the crowd, capturing faces filled with admiration, respect, and even a few tears. Whoopi stood up, signaling the official end of the interview. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it," she announced, her voice ringing out over the noise. "Mel Gibson, everybody. Give it up one more time for him." The applause grew even louder as Mel rose from his seat, shaking hands with the hosts and waving to the audience. He looked genuinely humbled by the response, smiling warmly as he made his way off stage. As he disappeared behind the curtains, the energy in the studio remained palpable, almost electric. It was the kind of moment that stays with people long after the credits roll. Back at the round table, Whoopi took a moment to reflect on what had just happened. "You know, she said, turning to Joy and Sunny. There's something powerful about seeing someone step into the arena, you know? Whether you love him or hate him, Mel showed up today. He didn't dodge the tough questions, and he didn't try to paint himself as some untouchable icon. He was real, and that's rare. Joy nodded emphatically, adding, and let's not forget, he handled your grilling like a champ, Whoopi. Not many people could keep up with you the way he did. Whoopi laughed, brushing off the compliment with a wave of her hand. Hey, I didn't go easy on him, that's for sure, she admitted. But credit where it's due. He held his own. And honestly, I think that's what made this conversation so great. It wasn't just about entertainment, it was about connection. About reminding ourselves that underneath all the headlines and controversies, we're all just people trying to figure it out. As the hosts wrapped up the episode, teasing upcoming guests and thanking the audience for tuning in, the buzz in the studio lingered. People filed out slowly, chatting excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. Social media lit up almost instantly, with fans and critics alike praising the raw honesty and humanity of the interview. Memes, GIFs, and quotes from the conversation flooded timelines, cementing its place in pop culture history. For Mel Gibson, it was a redemption arc of sorts, a chance to reconnect with the public on his own terms. For Whoopi Goldberg, it was another example of her ability to spark meaningful dialogue, even with the most unexpected guests. And for the audience, it was a reminder that sometimes the most impactful moments happen when we least expect them. By the time the credits rolled and the lights dimmed in the studio, one thing was certain. This episode of The View wasn't just television, it was a shared experience, a celebration of resilience, growth, and the power of open hearts and minds.